worship here this morning, turn to the person beside you and just say, yes, it's very profound. You are loved by our God, our Creator. What a great way to welcome each other in the house of the Lord this morning. Today, as we continue on through this wonderful series, The Power of God's Name, we're at the halfway mark, and I must say the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. And that tells me something. That tells me that people are listening and people are hungry for the Word of God. And today is going to be profound as we start part 3 in this series, The Powerful Names of God, as we look at Jehovah Nissi and Jehovah Sama. And as we heard this morning, the reading this morning from Exodus chapter 16 from 8, verses 8 to 16. Today is going to be profound because you will understand the biblical significance of relying on Jehovah Nissi and Jehovah Sama in gaining victory over your fears and over your battles and over the giant-sized problems that you are having and facing and dealing with in your life. But there is bad news. The bad news is life is full of problems. But the good news is God has a name for every one of your problems that you face that you can use to have complete victory to achieve the destiny and the call that God has placed on your life and the life and body of this church. There is a name that is applicable to every crisis that you are in and facing. And I've outlined today, at part 3, 5 ways that Jehovah Nissi and Jehovah Sama will help you address the giant-sized problems in your life. I will also be addressing every sin in your life. And some of us are still hanging out with evil in our lives. It keeps coming back. For some folk, they don't have a full-time evil, they have a part-time evil. Or maybe some folk don't have the part-time evil, but they're giving visitation rights to that evil. But then the visitation rights are now having squatters' rights. And now it's made itself home again. It's like being caught on a roundabout and you just can't find that exit to get off. And so it's going around and around and around and you're getting weighed down by that sin that is in your life. And you can't find that victory to that crisis of that sin that you're battling with. And for some people, they've been battling with it their whole lives. And for others, it seems to just go away and come back again. And you're wondering why. It just keeps getting worse. But God said He wanted to utterly blot out the memory of the Amalek from under heaven. In Exodus chapter 17, verse 14, it says this. Then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered and make sure that Joshua hears it, because I will completely blot out the name of Amalek from under heaven. Amalek represents the evil that's preventing you from reaching God's purpose and the destiny and the call that He's placed on your life. And God says you must address it fully if you're to have spiritual victory. Satan has your game field. I want you to understand this. I want you to grasp this. And this is important for you to understand. Satan has your game field. He watches your replay of your life over and over and over again. He studies you. He knows your every weakness. He knows how to get you to do things where you would never go, would never dream of thinking of doing. And he gets you to do that because he knows your weakness. He wants to paralyze you in fear. He wants to keep you bound up in bondage, and he wants to keep the church in bondage as well, because when he's got the church in bondage and he's got you in bondage, he's stopping the church and he's stopping you for having the victory and to fulfill the call that he's placed on your life and upon the life of this church. And there's nothing more sad than seeing people caught in that bondage, gripped by fear, where they don't want to move. It stops the church moving forward to becoming an intergenerational church. He wants you and the church to be sidetracked on doing good things, keeping you doing what's best, from fulfilling the destiny and the victory for which you've been created. If we look at background, history and culture here, if we look at the staff of Moses, the rod of Moses, Moses' staff was a shepherd's hook, and it was sanctified. And God had sanctified it some time earlier. It was the same shepherd's hook that brought about the plagues and opened up and parted the Red Sea. It's important to know that Moses' staff had been sanctified by God. God had used the natural to perform the supernatural. And if we look at the Amalek, it represents as the forces of evil because it stood in God's opposition for his purpose and for his people. Anything in your life, any sin in your heart that blocks you from doing what God wants to be done in and through you and for the life and body of his church is an Amalek. Now, the Amalek will try to thwart, prevent, frustrate, impede. It will try to stop God's purposes for worship, for progress, for growth, and the advancement of the church. And these Amaleks show up many times throughout the Old Testament, always trying to block God's people from going to where God wants them to go. Rephidim was a rugged desert place near Mount Horeb. It's where the water source had been very low. God's people were trudging through the desert and they were thirsty. But just when things appeared to improve, because the Israelites were finally wandering around in the desert and they were coming to the life streams of water, these little streams out into the desert, things started to go south again because the Amalekites showed up and wanted to fight them. To the Israelites, it looked as though God was no longer on their side. So what did Moses do? He went and built an altar and he named it Jehovah Nissi, the Lord is my banner. What made the Lord Moses' banner? The Lord had sworn that he would go to war against the Amalek from generation to generation. It was as if God was saying, whenever Amalek shows up, I will show up. Amalek is now on my radar. Whenever Amalek messes with you, he will mess with me because I am your banner. That's what God was like he was saying to the Israelites. And holding a banner in this case was the rod of God. And for us it could be flags or other types of items. And the word banner means to glisten. The rod of God glistened. Holding up that rod of God meant Moses was going to operate under God's banner. With God's protection. With God's provision. The banner was going to be over Moses and it was going to be his standard. So when we look at this, when we examine our heart, when we look at the sin in our life, it raises some serious questions. What's our banner today? Are we living and operating under God's standard? His banner for our lives. His will for his church. What are we exactly supposed to hold up as we enter into the battlefield in this life? And battling against the sin in our hearts. Because there's always giants, like Goliath. Goliath was over 9 feet tall. He came from a rare species called a Nephilim, and one of those dying breeds of giants whose reputation was enough to put absolute fear and anxiety into the enemy and keep them at bay. Goliath's looming presence dominated the entire landscape. His footsteps beat the ground. Draped over his supersized frame was a scale of armour, weighed 5,000 shekels. In 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 5 it says, he had a bronze helmet on his head, he wore a coat of scale of armour, bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. The armour alone probably weighed more than David himself. 70 kilos of armour made up of Goliath seemed totally impenetrable, and that was only his upper body. The passage goes on to tell us that he also had bronze greaves on his legs and a bronze javelin slung over his shoulders. And the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And the hand of his spear weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield carrier walked before him. And get this, before you even take on the battle, before you even take on that giant of sin, you need to take out the shield carrier that walks before it, before you even enter the battle, before you can even start to claim that victory. And you need to understand that. In 1 Samuel chapter 7, verses 6 to 7, it says, on his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. And it's interesting to note that it weighed around 6.9 kilos, nearly 7 kilos. Jehovah Sabbath means army, host, warfare. David knew God was the Lord of the army, the creator over all. The victory was ultimately his. And you can fight the battle. You can fight the Lord in battle. But guess what? You'll never beat the Lord. You just can't win. So the goal message today is this: Jehovah Nissi and Jehovah Sabbath to learn how to gain victory over your greatest fears through the Lord of the banner, the Lord of hosts. You know, in the Olympics, you'll see so many Australian banners being waved to demonstrate that the Aussies are supporting on and cheering on their fellow athletes. If you look at the NRL and the Broncos games, there's banners waved to show up who we're supporting and cheering them on for a victory. When I wave a banner at the football, I'm stating that this is the team I'm committed to. This is who I am. This is where my allegiance lies in the sport. And this is the one I'm looking towards for victory. But now, as you know, it doesn't always turn out that way. The banner may not wind up signifying a winner because of the limitations of the players that are operating on that banner. And your team has a competitor also with other people cheering on and waving their banners too. You'll see the Titans game on the Gold Coast, they have their fans and they're cheering on the Titans for a victory. Or now there's the Redcliffe Dolphins and their fans are waving banners and cheering them on for a victory because they're operating under that banner of the Dolphins. And you'll see this throughout all the NRL, the different fans supporting their different teams under different banners. Now, Ingrid thinks I'm a very strange person, but she married me anyway, so it's her own fault, right? Let me explain this to you. When Queensland played New South Wales in the State of Origin, I always wear my State of Origin Maroons jersey. Now, that may not seem strange, but I'll wear it for the complete victory. I go to bed in it and I sleep in it because I want to savour that victory and the feeling of victory all night long. And I won't wash that jersey until we have a defeat, because you've got to wash the defeat out, right? So you can get ready for another victory. So Ingrid thinks I'm a bit strange, but I think it's normal because I love the mighty Maroons. I believe Maroon. I'm such a football fanatic. But you know, there's other sports too, like in the AFL. They run through giant banners as they run onto the field. They seem to have the biggest banners of any sport that you'll ever see. And the banners are huge. And for most fans and sports around the sporting stadiums and the home grounds, you'll see these giant banners being waved. And thus the banners signify where you've placed your allegiance, where they lie, and under what authority they're operating under. And the goal of the banner is always the same: victory, victory, victory. But did you know, as a Christian, you're also waving the banner of victory? One of God's names is Jehovah Nissi, which means the Lord is my banner. That's what you're operating under as a Christian. And this comes from Exodus chapter 17, where God defeated the Amalekites. In response to Moses, built an altar and named it, the Lord is my banner. The Lord secured a victory for his people against the Amalekites, and he also won victory for his people against a giant-sized problem named Goliath and the Philistine army. Goliath was a Philistine who was a warrior over 9 feet tall. There was so much to fear about him. He was an evil force for the Israelites, and they feared him. It cast anxiety upon them. Perhaps in your own life, you're facing a giant-sized health problem. Maybe you've had someone that close to you, or someone you know that is undermining you, or undermining your ministry, or your character. Maybe you're dealing with a bully type of person in your sphere of influence. Perhaps you have a fear that seems so impossible that you can't defeat it. And now this anxiety has taken place of where peace once reigned freely and flowing freely in your heart, and you're consumed by the fear and anxiety. And for those of us in that camp, we have another name of God to encourage us, the Lord of Hosts. David knew God was the Lord of Hosts. And as the Lord of Hosts and the creator of everything, God always rises to victory. He will never give you defeat. The Lord of Hosts always wins every battle when you're in a right relationship with God, when you're reading His Word, when you're having that intercessory prayer on a daily basis and spending that time in worship. You will never face defeat because the Lord of Hosts will cover you, protect you, and provide for you. You will always win every battle that you face. And some of the most incredible things that God will ever do in your life and do in and through you will occur when you think you've got absolutely nothing left to give. And there's nothing left. Then God will give you that breakthrough. It's almost like you're in an emotional bankrupt and there's nothing else you can do because God has to do it all. Because when I'm weak, He is strong and God will give you victory. And when God secures that victory for you in His name, He gets all the glory. And have that confidence not only that you've gained that victory, but in His name there is power to give you back what the locusts have stolen over time. In Joel chapter 2 verse 25 it says this: I will repay for the years of the locusts of Eden, the great locust and the young locust, and all the other locusts and the locust swarm, my great army I've sent amongst you. Because we need to understand this. You need to face your fears with God's help. You need to rely upon God. Just as Moses told Joshua they had to fight against the Amalekites. In Exodus chapter 17 verse 9, Moses said to Joshua, choose some of our men and go and fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I'll stand on top of that hill and I'll have the staff of God in my hands. There will be obstacles you will face in your life. There will be giants that you will come up against. But take out that shield bearer. Stay in relationship with God. Read His Word. Spend time in prayer. And surround yourself with mature Christians who will not pull you down but will encourage you every step of the way and keep you in prayer, and you will gain that victory. You cannot hide from any obstacles, just as Moses and Joshua could not hide from the fact that they had to fight against the Amalekites, and they knew that they would have victory because God was on their side, being God's men, doing God's purpose and fulfilling the destiny that God has placed upon them and their people. In Exodus chapter 17 verse 9, Moses said to Joshua, choose some of our men, go fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I'll stand on the hill with the staff of God in my hands. Sometimes you need to step up and assume the responsibility and to fight that fight just like Joshua and his men. Moses had to fight on top of the hill with the staff of God in his hands, just as we see in Exodus chapter 17 verse 9. And when fighting, you need to rely on God's help. You cannot fight with human effort. You must turn to God on your knees and to rely on His holy power. The key to fighting is to do it courageously with the dependence on God's help. One extreme that people will take is to abdicate all personal responsibility and not fight at all. And just simply say, I'm trusting God's will that He will fix it. That may be an excuse for never taking action. Another extreme is to fight with only a human capability, and this person relies on skill or training or charisma and their own strength instead of relying on God's help and God's strength. But we need to do it, and you can't do it alone. You need to do it and face the fears in biblical community. And the key to fighting is to both bring forth the mountain and the valleys together. Moses stationed himself on top of the hill at the staff of God in his hands, and Joshua was to fight deep down into the valley. Moses was not to fight deep down in the valley alone. Instead, he was to wage war in the spiritual realms, lifting up the staff of God. Jesus is to be our standard. Jesus is to be our standard. You know, in the movie Inception, it's a movie about a dream world, and a man could enter into his dreams, and then he would have these dreams within the dreams. And the problem was that reality got all confused. So he created this totem. It was a spinning top, and it was there to guide him. And if he spun the top, and it kept spinning without falling over, he knew he was in the dream world. But if he spun the top and then eventually fell over, that meant that he was now in the real world. That's, in that movie, how he measured reality. For Christians, Jesus is our standard. For Christians, Jesus is how we are to measure reality. We are to operate through His will, not our will. Through His word, not by what man and society says. And we are to keep Jesus as our standard to deal with the battles that we are facing. And we are not to do it alone. We need to fight courageously with dependence on God's help. Joshua was to fight in the valley with his chosen men. When Moses' hands were heavy, he got the help of Aaron and Hur. Aaron and Hur put a stone under Moses and supported his hands, one on one side and one on the other. In Exodus chapter 17, verse 12 says, when Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him. He sat on it, so it propped him up, right? So then Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and one on the other, so his hands remained steady until sunset. Their only job was to help Moses maintain contact with God by supporting him. Someone who was starting to flail under the pressure and the stress. So they upheld him, they encouraged him, they prayed for him, they walked beside him. They didn't tear him down. They lifted him up because it was God's will for victory. You know, because of spiritual matters can often weigh us down, we need to have brothers and sisters who are there walking alongside us and supporting us and praying for us, so we can stay in a right relationship and staying in contact with God daily by reading His Word and upholding us in prayer. Because we need to change the perspectives by applying the character of God names to our situations that we find ourselves in. Just like Moses, David had a perspective that included the spiritual realm. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 45, it says this. David said to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of armies of Israel, whom you defied. David countered Goliath's mockery by announcing that he had the Lord of hosts, Jehovah Sama, on his side, whereas Goliath did not, because he did not know God. He was not in a right relationship with God. He was a Philistine. He had his own gods. David saw the spiritual reality behind the social problem. How many today fall into that trap? And not realise the spiritual reality that's facing the social problem in the crisis or Goliath problem that you are facing or dealing with in your life, and bleed out on those people around you instead of coming on your knees to God in prayer, spending time in His Word, gathering mature Christians around you
to uphold you, to encourage you, not chip you and not tear you down, and say, may God's will be done in and through this situation, and support you through it regardless of the outcome. David saw the spiritual reality behind the social problem. David understood that Goliath was not circumcised and he did not have God's covering. David told Goliath that he offended the Lord of hosts and that he would kill him, that he was going to take him out, he was going to take him down. And he did. David had confidence because he knew the power of God's names, because he was walking rightly in a right relationship with God, his Creator, who created all things and submitted his life and his will to God's will. Whereas the Israelites' perspective was focused on Goliath's physical size, his reputation, his stature. But David's perspective had refocused on God's power and God's will to take down the Goliathan problem that he was facing. And we too as Christians have victory in Jesus through the precious blood of Jesus. You know, it was a classic movie. We've all probably seen it multiple times in our lives, The Wizard of Oz. The lead character, Dorothy, winds up in another world. She starts out her journey in Kansas. She takes this whirlwind to a different place where she gets lost. And then a witch tells her to follow the yellow brick road, because at its end, she would finally find the city of Oz. And there in Oz, she would meet a wizard who could show her which way to go. And at the end of the movie, the wizard tells Dorothy she could have gone back to Kansas at any time she wanted. Her confusion was all in her head. All she needed to do was click her heels 3 times and she would have been taken straight back to Kansas. For Christians, victory is right here in front of us. All we need to do is turn to Jesus, seek his help, submit to him, his authority and his will for our lives, and pray, Lord, not my will be done, but yours be done. And he will give you victory over the elements in your life. Dr. Tony Evans says the reason you need the spiritual to make contact with heaven is because you not only want to address the situation, but the evil that is driving it. In other words, it's not just the giant that is there in front of you, but looking inward and asking, Lord, see if there's any offence in me that is stopping this victory. Check the heart, do a heart check, and ask God, is there any offence? In other words, what is the sin in my life that's stopping me from having this victory? That's what Dr. Tony Evans is driving at. You know, most of us can handle regular problems, the normal challenges that life throws up, but we don't like them. But they loom at a distance, and somehow we're able to keep going in spite of them. And yet when that one giant shows up in life, it seems to change everything. But get this. Battle belongs to the Lord. Give your battles to God. David understood that God was supreme, that God was provident over each and every situation that he found himself in. David informed Goliath that the Lord would deliver him into his hands. In 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 46 it says, the day of the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and I will cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds of the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. David stood up for God to face that challenge. David did not abdicate his personal responsibility. David chose to pick up those small stones for his sling to engage the Goliath in battle. David knew the names of God and the power that they carried. David trusted God for victory. We too need to trust God. We too need to use the powerful names of God. We too need to change our perspective. You know, the sun is a staggering size. But if you hold up a 20-cent piece to your eye and you look directly at the sun, that small coin will block out the enormity of the sun. Sometimes we allow the size of our problems to eclipse the size and power of our God. That's how we lose the battle. We allow something small to eclipse the great power of God. Need to change the perspective, change the focus, not on the crisis, not on the problem, but change it and put it on God. Put your focus on God. Do that heart check. What is that sin that is in my life that may be impeding the victory that I'm proclaiming for my life and for the life of the church? We need to change our perspective. You need to do what Moses did and bring the mountain and the valley together to experience that victory. And when you maintain that contact in the spiritual, in other words, when you have a right relationship with God, when you're spending time with God in worship, in prayer, and in His Word, being surrounded by mature Christians who will hold you up, who will encourage you and not tear you down, you will gain victory. If all you see is what you see, then you will do not what you will see, and all there is to be seen. A giant has a way of intimidating you at such a deep level that you will be so overcome with fear and anxiety that you will not proclaim that victory. So keep in mind the perspective is never just what you see. You only see this much. God sees this much. He sees the whole picture. Perspective is how you view what you see. Perspective is the key for you gaining and knowing and applying the character of God's names in order to live that abundant life, in order to have that destiny that God's call is placed on your life and on the life and body of His church, to go through those battles, for this church to become an intergenerational church and for you to proclaim victory over the sin that is in your life. 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 47 says, all those gathered here today will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is of the Lord's, and He will give all of you into our hands. I want to encourage you this morning. God's names covers all past, present and future, because God is the same yesterday, today and tomorrow into the future. But He also covers those giants who rear their ugly heads from time to time, and when they rear their heads, He will bring that victory. He will bring that victory because of His mighty power, and you coming before Him in prayer and worship, surrounded by mature Christians who will not tear you down but who will lift you up and encourage you every step of the way. And if you're not doing that, then have a look at your heart, because it is biblical to do so. Who do you know that needs to be lifted up? Who do you know that needs to be encouraged? What is it in your life that you need to come before God with fear and trembling and all humility and enter into His holy presence and ask for forgiveness? And maybe you need to go to someone and say, please forgive me. And if they're a mature Christian, they'll accept it wholeheartedly. And if they're not, and they don't, that's okay. Pray for them. Uphold them in prayer. Lift them up and encourage them. It's biblical to do so. God is bigger than any Goliaths. Now that we have this understanding, there are certain benefits and privileges that come with being a Christian. We are called upon and use the names of God to win and to give deliverance and to give you victory. So use the names of God in every difficult situation you find yourself in, against every sin battle that you're battling. We're at the halfway mark here in the Powerful Names of God series. And we are called to use these powerful names. The powerful names of God. Yahweh, Elohim, Jehovah, Adonai, Jehovah Nissi, and Jehovah Saba. Coming to the holy presence of God this morning. Come before Him with fear, trembling, and humility, and ask for forgiveness for the sin that may be stopping you proclaiming the victory and destiny is placed on your life and the life and body of this church. As we close out this service, we're going to sing about, or I want you to sit, and you can sing along and reflect upon two other names, powerful names of God, the Lion and the Lamb. And then we'll finish the service with a blessing. Thanks.